Video games have always been cool. In 1978, some guy at an audio tech company called Taito designed Space Invaders and caused a national invader craze. Introducing wild features like the ticking timer that is these cutesy alien guys meant everyone was playing video games in Japan, with the rest of the world to follow. That little alien guy right there is synonymous with the medium of video games, and its popularity had a formative ripple effect on the game industry at large. Heck, not even just the game industry. You might have heard of this super niche underground band called the Beatles. While the band Happy End were kinda sorta Japan's own Beatle equivalent due to their impact, notable for singing in Japanese rather than English and also making me cry every time I listen to them. The band's members, Eiichi Otaki, Takashi Matsumoto, Shigeru Suzuki, and Haruomi Hosono all started smearing their hands all over the Japanese music industry after breaking up, which would have further groundbreaking impacts. Matsumoto has written tons and tons of pop songs. Otaki pioneered city pop with the members of Sugar Babe. Suzuki got arrested for Japan's strict laws on weed possession. And Hosono did a bunch of cool shit too. It's difficult to simplify this into one brief retrospective explanation, but around the boom and popularity of Space Invaders as well as arcade games in general, he paid attention to the sound of these games, the unique noises they made, his interest stemming from his experience with electronic music. After collaborating on the album Paraiso as the Yellow Magic Band, he, along with Yukihiro Takahashi and Ryuichi Sakamoto, would work on an experimental electronic album, making use of those inspiring bleeps and or bloops from stuff like Space Invaders and Taito Circus. The self-titled album, Yellow Magic Orchestra, launched in 1978, and in due time the band became huge. While their work isn't traditionally pop-y, folks were receptive of the computer wave, and they essentially heralded a new age for Japanese music. Their cultural impact is monumental, influencing artists of all kinds, and particularly directly affecting the way game music would end up sounding. Like, game music as a concept was barely a thing when they started out, and game composers of the 80s still had to work with limited electronic sounds. So developers all over looked to YMO's perfection of the craft as an inspiration, which in turn had a ripple effect on the whole industry. I'm a huge YMO fan, but this video isn't actually about them. This was actually all about Yuji Naka.
Why did you enter the game industry?
I was interested by computers. I was also influenced by Ryuichi Sakamoto's group YMO and its synthesizers. YMO influenced numerous game developers in Japan. Not only me, they were a very big influence on my generation.
So Sega had been around for years before video games happened, and were already a noticeable force in the arcade market. They distributed regular non-video arcade games, but their first major video game was Head-On, which is almost a prototypical Pac-Man. They also distributed Konami's Frogger, but I think it took until about the mid-80s for Sega to actually become the Sega we know today. Hang On, designed by future Shenmue freak Yu Suzuki, is a defining release for the company, alongside Space Harrier and Fantasy Zone and Outrun. These are all essential Sega hits, but by the time Outrun happened, they'd already been fending off Nintendo in the console market for a few years. The SG-1000 released alongside the Famicom and was host to the first game developed by Yuji Naka, Ghouls Gaiden. It's okay. Naka would keep developing console games for Sega, though right after Ghouls Gaiden, the Sega Master System launched and he began working on stuff for that instead. He worked on some arcade ports for the Master System and a licensed Fist of the North Star game, but I'd say the first major game he worked on originally was Phantasy Star, Sega's answer to Dragon Quest that incorporated the first-person dungeon crawling of early computer RPGs. Because of the overseas popularity of the Master System in places like Europe and South America, Phantasy Star seriously might have had a bigger international impact than Dragon Quest at the time. With the next decade around the corner, Sega put out the Mega Drive in 1988. Cripes, those guys sure were fast. They put out the Mega Drive, and Yuji Naka worked on a new Phantasy Star game for it, as well as a port of Ghouls and Ghosts, or its way cooler Japanese name, Dai Makaimura. And that's it, that's all he ever worked on. Yuji Naka has since gone missing and never programmed anything ever again. So I just made a 2-hour video about Kingdom Hearts a few months ago, and I know the kind of impression that gives off, but please please believe me, I'm not a Sonic fan. I don't even have any cute stories about the Sonic games I played growing up. I just never played them. I didn't read the comics, I didn't watch the cartoons. My only exposure to Sonic was through cultural osmosis and YouTube videos.
More like 6 feet underground!
In fact, cultural osmosis and YouTube videos have led to my knowledge of the series being pretty extensive despite never really touching it. Like, I know all the characters' names, I can tell you that people love Sonic Mania, that the Sonic movie originally looked ugly, that there was a 90s Sonic OVA, that Sega put out a Puyo Puyo reskin named Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. I know all the Ken Pender's legal lore, and Michael Jackson worked on Sonic 3. This is nothing new to me, and if you're in this corner of the net, then it's gonna be nothing new to you either. I just somehow never had the urge to get into the games themselves. I think for a lot of folks, Sega are just the Sonic Yakuza Persona guys, which is a little lame because the more Sega history I see, the more I appreciate their whole deal. Naturally, they get compared to Nintendo all the time, but that really seems like a result of the harsh rival marketing the two companies engaged with once the Mega Drive proved generally more popular than the Super Nintendo worldwide. It really seems like game history to a lot of folks is Nintendo-centric. Like, Atari invented video games and then they made E.T. and killed video games forever, so Nintendo swooped in to save the day with the NES, and soon Sega challenged the Super Nintendo by making Sonic, and then Sonic had a rough transition to 3D because of how good Super Mario 64 is, and then Sega was defeated once and for all because the Dreamcast failed, glossing over any other competition, failing to consider different national markets, not even once mentioning home computers, because in the eyes of Nintendo fans, vintage computer games aren't even real games. The reality that people actually think this may vary, but after about a decade of non-stop video game YouTube consumption, this is the consensus that I've personally gathered. I'm guilty of being something of a Nintendoid myself, so I've rarely engaged with much of Sega's library of games. Despite that, I loved playing Shenmue last year, and researching that game got me wanting to explore more Sega in general. Shenmue itself is an overly ambitious adventure game directed by an arcade specialist, and it's really just interesting to me that this company went all in on something like that. Really, I wanted to see what I've been missing out on. It's something I do a lot. I've been pushing myself to see all kinds of new stuff over the past year or so, and Sega is an entire dimension of video games I know nothing about. So anyway, in the late 1980s, the Mega Drive released, and the team at Sega were devising a new mascot. Learning the language that is Sonic the Hedgehog was rough at first. My reference point for 2D platformers is pretty much just what Mario does. You go from A to B, jumping and running in certain ways that get more challenging as you go. I thought Sonic would be like this too, because surely, right? Instead, the first Sonic game is a trial in patience, featuring difficulty and design tropes that were probably more conventional at the time. Granted, game difficulty over time isn't a straight line, but in 1991, audiences must have been more receptive to enduring bullshit, because Sonic 1 has loads of it. Wait, no, come back, I'm not being negative. I stink bad at games, but I feel like this game just isn't concerned with how much the player can understand it at first. It's evident that the designers used arcade logic to dazzle the player and flash lights in their face and give them just enough of a chance that they're invested once they get a game over and need to cram more coins in to keep going. Except, this is a console game, so the arcade logic is unnecessary but a result of early design sensibilities. It's flashy, like the kind of thing that's meant to draw you in among a row of other cabinets. The visuals vary from sensible to abstract, especially when you enter the special stage, and on top of this, every aspect of the actual gameplay is bewildering. Playing this blind was culture shock in action. So like, why is it like this? Every game has its own learning curve, but I found Sonic 1 to be especially jarring after being used to other types of platformers for so long. And I guess the answer could just be that it's old, that Sega was still somewhat new to console game design, or that it's the kind of thing that just grows on you. But what if it's not even to do with the game itself? Sonic's design was influenced by the cool kid attitude of the era, taking influence from icons like Michael Jackson and Bill Clinton. Sonic's design was influenced by the cool kid attitude of the era, the design being conceived by Naoto Oshima in an effort to scientifically manufacture the perfect mascot. Sega's chances at success in the console space were hindered by Nintendo's obnoxious popularity in Japan and the US, so they began strategizing to launch new software with the hopes of gaining that kind of market relevance. Naka and Oshima came up with a tech demo for the game that would pivot Sega's position in this market, and that tech demo formed the basis of Sonic's concept. A little guy that can roll around. From the very start, Sega needed this mascot to be a hit with Americans, hence all the ratitude, but I think this plays a bigger part in Sonic's identity than I initially considered. The US is one of the biggest audiences they could aim for, but plenty of games are popular without being crafted for specific regions. With Sonic, the Americanness is ingrained in there. Sega were far more concerned with Sonic as a brand mascot than the specifics of his game's design. That tech demo could have taken any form and just happened to end up like this. It's definitely novel for the time and does a great job showcasing the power of the hardware, but I feel like it was popular for similar reasons as Tetris was popular on the Game Boy. It was marketed well, and it was packed in with every Mega Drive unit. If anyone wanted this hot new console at the time, they were playing Sonic with it, whether they liked it or not. I want to emphasize all this because I really don't think this first Sonic game has any of the juice its fine-tuned marketing promises. Ignoring the artificial playtime inflation every game of this age had with its limited continue system, the pacing of this game really smells. The literal pacing, like how fast you go, is inconsistent through each level. The first stage fools you into thinking everything's fast and you just need to avoid a few obstacles in your path, while the second stage smacks you in the face with, like, pushing bricks. For the record, I don't take a problem with the slowness. If anything, I get overwhelmed by speedy gameplay. But it really shocked me that the game insists on your patience and memorization of each level's layout. It relies on this for progression because of how strict the hazard placement is and how little space it gives you to mess up in most cases. Most levels are like labyrinths filled with death traps, and while playing, it kinda gave me a headache. I was thinking the whole time that it's really not my type of game, and the frustrating precision required while controlling with physics so slippery was just really bumming me out. Like, these are clearly fast car controls that don't fit the intricate level design at all. I'm not sure how many people actually liked this game for its gameplay more than just its pitch-perfect branding, but times were different. Game Pro Magazine gave Sonic the Hedgehog a glowing score overall, praising all areas with a 5 out of 5 except for its sound, I guess, and calling Sonic the fastest creature on 2 legs that the Genesis has ever seen. Technically, they probably weren't wrong, but the game really isn't that fast. The Sonic chronology is already confusing because Sonic 2 and CD were developed at the same time, and this is where the whole branding thing becomes kind of important. On one end, you have the rebellious Chewed, mainly appealing to the American crowd, and on the other, you have the sort of cute manga-inspired pop icon version of Sonic. A huge part of the first Sonic game was the involvement of Masato Nakamura, a pop artist from the band Dreams Come True, but that's not really something that matters to general audiences outside of Japan. It was news to me when researching for this video, and I've heard all kinds of nonsense about the Sonic series up until now. After Sonic 1's proven success, work on the sequel began in the American Sega Technical Institute, while Sega of Japan began developing a CD-ROM peripheral for the Mega Drive. While the console did initially rival the NES and then later the Super Nintendo, in terms of specs it was more akin to NEC's relatively demanding PC engine, which itself had a CD add-on in 1988. By adapting that tech, Sega would be a step ahead of Nintendo, but on essentially equal grounds with NEC. The PC engine, and especially its CD peripheral, doesn't really get much discussion, but it undeniably motivated the development of the Mega CD and its latent killer app, Sonic CD. As Sonic CD began development, Yuji Naka actually left Sega only to eventually rejoin as part of the Sega Technical Institute, founded by Mark Cerny, formerly of Atari and futurely of Sony. The story of Sonic 2's development is long and winding, involving a certain amount of tension between Japanese and American staff, but while all that went on, the team left at Sega Japan adapted Sonic for the Mega CD. Naka, who programmed Sonic 1, and Hirokazu Yasuhara, who designed its levels, both worked on Sonic 2. Oshima was left to direct the Sonic team in Japan, essentially meaning Sonic CD expanded on aesthetics while Sonic 2 expanded on technical traits. This is obvious when comparing the final products, and overall signifies Sonic's migration to the States, I guess.
Toy capsules. 100 yen each, huh? Maybe just one. Hey, what's this?
Rolling Star!
Changed my mind.
While my history with the Sonic series is very limited, I can safely tell you that CD was actually the first one I ever played. Its iOS release in the early 2010s meant it was lumped in with the other app games I'd borrow my parents' iPad to play, and I could barely comprehend what was even going on, but it established my knowledge of what Sonic games are even like. Pretty stylish, if overwhelming for a kid. This formative experience means my judgment leans more in CD's favor here by default, but after playing Sonic CD and Sonic 2 back to back, I gotta say, yeah, Sonic CD is the best one, man. The entire Sonic series has some pretty famous music, and the soundtrack of the first game is especially iconic, but I don't know, a lot of the music from that game kinda just got on my nerves as I played, partially due to its sound, but largely due to just how much I've heard it before. Overused in however many videos I've seen online. Sonic CD famously has a great soundtrack, which also gets used a ton, except, like, this is actually nice to listen to and doesn't get on my nerves as I play the game. Sonic CD also famously has two of them, one originally made for the Japanese release and the other made only for the American release. I played the original Japanese version of the game for its soundtrack and NTSC-ness, but the music in the US version, while still fitting just fine, is wildly different for no reason other than branding. This is somehow another result of Sonic's identity being split across regions, because the guy in charge of music in the US thought having a more musically rich and complex soundtrack would fit the American release better. It's just cold hard evidence that Americans are dweebs. After the first game, it was so refreshing to play something that didn't give me 9 headaches in a row back to back, not just due to the music but also the level design. They actually designed this game around Sonic's speed and physics. It's messed up. This did come with the possible drawback that I was kinda caught in a sort of trance all the way through. Like, I was finding it so easy that I just breezed through it all and got into the zone, which didn't happen with Sonic 1. It isn't quite as challenging, which for some might genuinely be a bad thing, but I was 100% good with it. I loved playing it. It was like if a roller coaster was a platformer. The last few stages did get more difficult to navigate through, like I ran out of time at one point, but I was still fine with that, and I think this game is lovely and cool. This means that I actually like a Sonic game. While CD expanded the gameplay of Sonic 1 off in a funky direction, 2 kinda kept things in a straight line to provide more of a direct sequel. As a result, I liked Sonic 2 way less. It's a better game than 1 for sure, but it takes far less risks than CD. It serves its purpose as a sequel well, I'm just not sure if I'm the biggest fan of how it rigidly maintains the gameplay of 1. I found CD fun because it's kinda silly and messy, but in an endearing way, while 2 only streamlines the awkward bumps that Sonic 1 had. In essence, I think 2 is boring, but it's by no means a bad time. Well, I mean, except for the final boss sequence that really stank. Game Pro Magazine gave Sonic 2 the same score as Sonic 1 actually. By this point the challenge rating had changed from a numeric score to a category, but the other points remain pretty much the same. The sound is only a little better this time. I'm sure with this out they probably changed their minds on the first game, but $55? Contrary to what I thought, they actually gave Sonic CD a higher score, an all-perfect rating now that the music has improved. I feel like I've heard the sentiment that CD is worse than 2 a lot, but if this is anything to go by, maybe the people who prefer 2 are just massive weenies. By 1994, the Sonic series only grew. Everyone wanted to be the new Sonic, and even Sega pumped out more and more spin-offs to capitalize on its success. This included stuff like Sonic Spinball, Sonic Chaos, ports of 1 and 2 for Game Gear, an arcade game, and Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. Mean Bean Machine, naturally, is a reskin of the then-obscure puzzle game Puyo Puyo tailored for Western audiences, and serves as yet another example of Sonic's weird cultural divide. It's also wholly based on the cartoon that they made. I'm not sure how gradually this phenomenon came about, but Sonic was certainly a huge hit with global audiences by the time Sonic 2 released. As a result of this mass popularity, adaptations of the character were produced in comic and cartoon form, serving to expand the world and characters of the series for the American market. This whole ordeal is kinda messy because while the US got a Sonic publication from Archie Comics, the UK had its own publication from Fleetway, and Japan had its own publication in Shogakukan's Korokoro, splitting the character's identity across regions. Despite that split, Sonic's only animated presence was in the form of the American cartoons from none other than Dick Entertainment, sort of solidifying the American version of the franchise as the default. This seeps through into the games, as Sega Technical Institute was established in the US and so must have had the American demographic in mind when developing the Sonic series. Sonic 2 and 3 were made with the involvement of Japanese developers, but the American studio made its own spin-off, Sonic Spinball, and Mean Bean Machine was reskinned solely using characters from the Dick cartoon series. At this point, not only was the branding of the series different per region, but the US branch of Sega took strong initiative in establishing Sonic as more American than Japanese, affecting the entire franchise as a result. The complexity of the series was already so vast that I can't document it all here, but Sonic's American raditude was evidently strongly taken into account when the team at Sega Technical Institute developed Sonic 3. This is clear because they developed the game like a burger, wanting it to be as big as possible, adding layers upon layers of beef and cheese, before realizing the Mega Drive could only handle a hot dog. Instead of scaling it back, they just split the game into 2 cartridges, Sonic Cheese and Sonic and Burger, to be combined into Sonic Cheese and Burger. Americans loved it. Generally, it was a turbulent period for video games as the next generation loomed over Sega. Sonic 3 pushed the Mega Drive to its limits as one of Sega's final games for the platform, serving as a suitable send-off before they went all in on the Saturn, or the 32X. Both? It's a massive production, larger than any Sonic game before it except CD, and so the big guns were brought out. Infamously, the game's music was composed by Michael Goddarn Jackson and his team, the very same Michael Jackson that influenced Sonic's character in the first place. Jackson himself went uncredited, but his involvement led to weird licensing problems regarding the soundtrack, meaning Sonic 3 barely gets re-released. His involvement was largely speculated upon and not exactly confirmed for a long while, but when the Sonic Origins collection came out, Naka spilt the beans on the matter. Despite how much of a fun trivia fact this is, it is genuinely really neat as a moment for video game music. The first 2 games already had Masato Nakamura, so the series was already musically involved, but it's impressive that they pushed these kinds of boundaries even before disc-based games took over. Despite such strong force behind it though, the soundtrack still isn't as good as Sonic CD. If it wasn't obvious, Sonic 3 is a huge show-off of a game. Everything about it is basically just there to brag about how cool and advanced it is, which in some ways is very welcome because it means the game doesn't have as much performance slowdown and there are save files now. While the save option is nice and made the whole playthrough less stressful, it only demonstrates that the game is way longer than the others, like twice as long as Sonic 2. Thankfully, it's overall less daunting because it's also easier than Sonic 2, kinda matching CD in smoothness. By this point I really felt a groove to the gameplay. I felt it in 2 and especially in CD, but 3 feels especially brain turn off-y because of its easiness. The optional challenge of collecting every emerald is always there, but this was my first time, I wasn't doing that. A lot of the show-offiness is from the graphics, and yeah, there's a lot of spectacle, and it's impressive for the hardware. I just feel like it suffers from the same issue Sonic 2 had, where the developers just wanted to refine and fine-tune and smoothen out the experience as much as possible, adding a bunch of visual flair and unique mechanics along the way. It continues the linear progression and complexity that Sonic 2 established, but I can't help feeling like the level design was just okay. A lot of the game was breezy, but it felt like awkward obstacles would frequently get in the way rather than being a natural part of the level. The circus barrel is the famous example of this kind of thing, and the junky door puzzle stuff from Sandopolis Zone felt especially gross. The levels are also way longer, they often overstay their welcome, and I ran out of time more than once. From my understanding, this is considered the best 2D Sonic game, and admittedly only having played it once, I just don't really see it. And just like Sonic 2, the final level gave me a headache, so it feels like there's a pattern of weird difficulty curves. Game Pro Magazine said that to play as Bill Clinton, you use the code ARK and... Wait. Game Pro Magazine said that Sonic 3 is exactly as good as Sonic 1, the sound taking a hit compared to 2, but they gave Sonic & Knuckles a perfect score, meaning overall it's about as good as 2 was. Basically, CD is still the better game. Anyway, both cartridges were $70, meaning that Sonic 3 and Knuckles was a $140 video game, meaning it's about $300 in today money. Jeez.
Set, go!
Shortly after Sonic 3 came out, Sega released the Saturn in 1994, with international releases following the year after. This is where the regional split I keep going on about is crucial. You can just look at the regional console variants and see their contrasting values, but it's clear from pretty much every aspect that the Japanese Saturn and the international Saturn may as well be different consoles. The Saturn, famously, was an enormous flop in the US market for a variety of reasons, including mixed signals from the simultaneous 32X peripheral for the Mega Drive, a surprise early Saturn launch that the company very much wasn't prepared to handle, and a lack of third-party support. Sony's PlayStation, the main competition, was designed with sturdy 3D capabilities, while the Saturn hardware is more like an advanced 2D machine that technically could do 3D but wasn't initially built for it, meaning developers that were banking on polygons were met with awkward programming architecture.
3D のマシンではないのに、そのポリゴンのマシンではなくて、スプライトのマシンで 3D を作るっていう、そんなことをさせた会社がちょっとどうかしてるんだと思うんですけど。
2D games, which were still commonplace in Japan where the Saturn did well, fit the platform much better. Sega were no strangers to 3D design though. Their polygonal arcade games were cutting-edge powerhouses, but this didn't really translate to the Saturn. Not in the way Sonic fans wanted, that's for sure. Naka and Oshima regrouped to develop Nights into Dreams for the Saturn, moving on from the Sonic series and leaving the platform with no initial Sonic title. Sega Technical Institute hurried to develop a 3D Sonic game, but it was cancelled and swiftly replaced with the technically 2D isometric Sonic 3D Blast. Sega Japan didn't see Sonic as a priority, developing titles for their own market first and foremost, while the Saturn's international success hinged on it, only for the hinge to awkwardly squeak before snapping off. At least it got gags.
It's tail time!
Because of all this, it could be said, maybe, possibly, if you wanted to put it that way, that Sonic the Hedgehog had a rough transition into 3D. Except, no, not really. Since the Saturn was designed primarily as a CD-ROM platform with a strength for PC and arcade ports, it seems like Sega as a whole had just as much of a rough transition into 3D, at least in the console space. With the Sonic series having no mainline Saturn title, it rapidly went in the same unusual direction Sonic CD branched off to. Rather than a linear progression of the formula brought to the third dimension, this generation would be home to a wilder experimental side of the series, demolishing the consistency of the brand along the way. Hey, did you know Archie made a Knights comic too? I was honestly only gonna talk about the main Mega Drive games in this video, but games like Sonic the Fighters and Sonic R are just too interesting not to cover. These are the first 3D Sonic games. I mean, 3D Blast sort of counts, but it's really just isometric 2D and makes me motion sick. Sonic the Fighters, an arcade exclusive, is a unique fighting spin-off from the Virtua Fighter guys at Sega AM2, and it's the first actual 3D Sonic game, and I like it a lot. While I stink at fighting games and I'm unfamiliar with Virtua Fighter, unless we're counting Shenmue, I had a fun time with it. It stylishly converts these character designs into chunky polygonal visuals, proving that the series at least could be 3D if it wanted to. Its gameplay is fun, but maybe isn't the greatest. Like, a lot of battles I could just repeatedly use one move, but it's still just tough enough that any win is satisfying. And everyone's so pointy. It's cute. Sonic R is the one I really love here though. It's from Traveler's Tales, the British devs behind 3D Blast, but it features a lot of the same spirit I felt in Sonic CD with some real junk food gameplay. Even though it's a racing game, you're not confined to the course layout at all, and you can just mess around in order to find hidden stuff, and it's really clear that no one knew what they were doing, but it comes together to be more enjoyable than any of the other games I've covered here. Like, as much as I loved Sonic CD, Sonic R really comes close, and it made me smile a whole lot more. Everything about it embodies this refreshing, carefree energy that reminds me just how cool video games are. The music is really vital to that vibe. A bunch of dance music by TJ Davis and Richard Jock, who also made music for the Saturn port of 3D Blast. In the time since, he's also worked on a bunch of soundtracks that I personally love, so I'm definitely more inclined to enjoy the music here. I think this game gets a lot of shit for how it's not a real Sonic game or whatever, being associated with one of the series' lowest points, but it's intoxicatingly lovely nonetheless. Game Pro Magazine. Put the wrong screenshot there to start with. They gave it a 60% preview score, but referred to the Saturn version's supposedly unfinished state as a setback and said it's really just for Sonic fans. A month prior, they gave Sonic Jam, the collection of each mainline Sonic Mega Drive game for the Saturn, a summative 17 out of 20, which, while not that bad, is lower than the original scores given to each game. Sonic was no longer the all-perfect mega hit that it was a few years earlier. It wouldn't be far-fetched to call this era the Sonic slump, with the Saturn straying far from the kind of environment the series was initially popular in. But the character didn't just vanish off the face of the earth. Those Mega Drive games didn't go anywhere at all, nor did the TV show or comics, and another adaptation suddenly arose. A movie. Kinda. While the series' animated presence was almost solely the Dick Entertainment cartoons, a very different interpretation of Sonic came to us from Pierrot, the anime studio behind adaptations of Urusei Yatsura, Osumatsu-kun, Naruto, Bleach, and countless piles of others. They made an OVA based on the series, apparently taking heavy influence from Sonic CD, meaning it rules. While the Japanese release was split into 2 TV episode-length halves, the localized release branded it as Sonic the Hedgehog of the movie, meaning it is technically a movie, I guess. Not that it's feature-length, but it is a whole self-contained story, and considering the Sonic slump, it's a pretty big deal. Like, where did this even come from? By this point, the divide in modes of Sonic couldn't be more blatant, and the Sega Technical Institute ceased to exist the same year. There was nothing pushing the series forward in the same way. Any new releases were experimental spin-offs, and the Sonic team itself worked on different original titles. So, in a sense, Sonic laid dormant while Sega shifted focus to literally anything else. After a few years on the market, the Saturn melted to goo as Sega desperately aimed to get back on track.
I believe you should speak with the language you feel most comfortable expressing yourself with. That goes for any country in the world, not just Japan. There are no filters.
It's pretty beautiful how interpretive Sonic was from the very beginning. With this project, I wanted to basically just learn about the Sonic games myself, discover what people like about the series, and explore its background, and I just wasn't expecting it to already be this complex. From the outside, the Sonic series seems pretty simple, but the way it branches out across various interpretations makes it shockingly malleable. Unlike a lot of other game series, your enjoyment most certainly depends on your own experience interpreting the games, with accessibility and simplicity being a key factor, but the world and characters having just enough depth to be taken in a multitude of ways. Compared to, like, the Mario series, which tightly maintained its brand with different interpretations being the outliers rather than the norm, the Sonic series embraces its global appeal by kind of just being whatever you want it to be. I'm certain that this is the reason for its passionate fanbase. Despite the mid-90s Sonic slump, Sega acknowledged the ongoing demand, and Sonic Team began development on his first true 3D adventure for their early 6th gen console, the Dreamcast. In a sort of weird full-circle moment, the Dreamcast's startup sound was composed by Ryuichi Sakamoto, 1/3 of Yuji Naka's reason for entering game development. Sonic Adventure would end up being a bestseller for the Dreamcast, being a more focused iteration of the series that kind of rebooted things and laid the foundation for the rest of the series since. I'm not discussing it yet, though I don't want to make this video like 3 hours long. Overall, at this point, I'm not really sure what I want to say with this video. Playing the Sonic games blindly has been fun, and the series is fun, but it's strange when you do what I did and play it scientifically and in retrospect. This is a very recent experience for me, so maybe it'll just stick with me over time, but the general takeaway from this whole project has been realizing that Sega is really just cool. A bunch of their games are really important, influential, or just interesting, and I don't hear enough about them because of how Sonic overshadows the rest of their catalog. I found it tough to view this series the same way as other stuff I've covered. I don't feel as deeply invested, and I feel like it really is just because everyone talks about it all the time. I'm kinda out of my element. I enjoyed my time here, though. I thought getting myself to play these games would be like cramming a cube into a triangular hole, but after a while the cube just sort of phased through the hole with no regards to physics. If anything, I'd have a hard time finding it in me to really dislike any of these games, but the series has always been very divisive, even amongst its fans. I'd rank them or something, but it would feel a little mean if I was pitting them against each other. Sonic CD was definitively the best one, though. Hello. It is July now. I started working on this video in like April-ish, technically. I started playing the games in April. I really only started working on this in May, and then I edited it for like most of June. Actually, that's not true. I edited it for 2 weeks. Like the past couple of weeks has been me editing, and now it's done, and I think it came out pretty okay. I guess it's fine. I usually ramble on, but I kind of want to keep this one quick, just like Sonic himself. Oh my goodness, it's quite early. It's quite late. It got so late that it became early. It is 8 AM, so there might be like outside noise. But okay, hi. Thank you for watching the video a lot. I really appreciate it. A lot of people watched my last video on Kingdom Hearts 2, which I wasn't quite expecting. The amount of people that watched that, like, it's a lot. Like, it's a lot. Like, it is my most popular video right now, and that's messed up. Like, that, along with the support from Patreon, has been really, like, since the Kingdom Hearts 2 video, it's been a lot stronger. Like, I kind of forget that, like, at the start of the year, the Patreon wasn't really a thing. And now, like, there are a lot of people to thank through Patreon. So I really appreciate the support there. If you want to support the channel but don't want to subscribe to Patreon for whatever reason, for whatever like grudge you have against the color orange, I think they still use the color orange on there. I could be wrong. Then you can donate to the Ko-fi, the Ko-fi, which is just like a more direct way of supporting if you don't want to go through the whole like subscription situation, which is understandable because like forgetting that you're subscribed to something is something that happens a lot. But yeah, it's just whatever the case, you don't have to, but I would really appreciate it, and it would be like a continued like motivation for me to keep making videos. I would like to make another video at some point, but there's a lot of things happening at the moment. I have a lot going on. It's why this video could have come out sooner, hypothetically, but I had studies in the way, and I have more studies in the way, like upcoming. I also have summer in the way. This is meant to be my break, but I'm like in between moving, which is why I'm in this room and not in the room that I was in last time. So that's messed up. I'm gonna be in a different room next time, probably. Massive thank you to Sarah, the YouTube channel Ethereal Worlds, for being a good friend and also being a massive Sonic fan, but like not from like the usual, I guess the only way I can describe it is like the usual perspective that Sonic fans have is like that's not the perspective that she has, because like she goes at it from more of like a like early 90s computer demo scene, like Amiga. I don't, it's not really something that I know much about, but the way that like a lot of British developers at the time must have seen Sonic and been like, oh, like, whoa, and made games like on the Amiga and everything. And that's not something that I did go into, but it's something that I would have liked to go into. Just the impact that it had on other games. I mean, obviously it's immense. Her next video is about Sonic, and that's coming out like very, very soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Please go and subscribe to her channel and watch her videos. They are really good. Genuinely like a huge inspiration for this video, because that rules. There are a couple of things that I wanted to mention that I didn't really get to mention in the video, or at least like I didn't really have a place for in the video, or I didn't need to mention it, but I do want to mention it anyway. Like, at one point I used footage from an interview that was in a Pandemonium video, who has this like incredible series, this like really underrated channel, genuinely, with an incredible series reviewing every single Sega Saturn game, or at least all of the ones released in the US, and like going at it from the perspective of the US. And it's really fascinating because it's like this platform that no one really gives that much time for, that this one guy is just like going really in depth on. They are genuinely like some of the best videos that I've seen when it comes to documenting like game development history. He got the Sega Rally guy in the most recent video. He got the guy that drives the Sega Rally car, like to interview. Like that's a real thing that happened. Like if like I cannot believe this, like this video series essentially like informed me on a lot about the Sega Saturn that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. because like there just aren't really that many resources on it, and I haven't really had the time to like go through a bunch of Sega Saturn games myself. Like, a lot of the footage of Sega Saturn games that I used in this video were from demo discs. Also, there's like an enormous thing that I didn't really mention regarding Sega, like Sega's relationship with music. And it's sort of like relates to the way that YMO inspired game composers, because one of the earliest like uses of like licensed music in video games is Sega like licensing a YMO song for Super Locomotive, their arcade game. And this is something that I knew, and I just never really thought to mention in this video. But like the fact that they did that really early on, like it must have like later affected like the fact that they worked with Masato Nakamura from Dreams Come True for Sonic the Hedgehog. And it's just interesting that like that sort of did originate with Yellow Magic Orchestra, and I just never really thought to make that connection. It's like, oh yeah, I should have mentioned that, really. That's kind of like the connective tissue of like this whole video. So yeah, thank you for watching the video. I'm gonna go to bed now. I've said thank you like a million times. Thank you! I really appreciate it. I think it was a video.